Thank you, Anime. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And thanks to IACM Tripura chapter for inviting me. I think I would have loved to come to your place, man, rather than doing this online business. But I think another 6 to 9 months, I think, before all this starts again. I'm just waiting for it. I'm dying for it, actually. And of course, thanks to Dr. Mukut Roy for getting in touch with me, being so nice to listen to all my whims because I had another meeting and I thought I would not be able to finish by 8:30. So I had requested to go after Sunil Kota. So Sunil, thank you very much. And not my problem. You see, the meeting is got a bit delayed, so it's 9 o'clock. So I'm coming in at 9 o'clock. So I've been given a topic about pathophysiological management of diabetes. And if I get my slides going, I think they are visible. Can somebody please shout out?
Yes, yes, it's visible.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So here I start my race of 25 minutes targeting pathophysiology of type 2 diabetes. And because this session, my friends, is sponsored by MSD, we have a little bit of focus on the elderly in the latter half of my talk. Now, before I go into pathophysiological management of diabetes, I have one disclaimer, which I think Dr. Pranab Shahana was referring to in his last slide when he was talking about management of diabetes with insulin, is basically holistic management of diabetes. Diabetes is not just management of glycemic control. Please don't think that. Diabetes is holistic management. You have to get the blood pressure under control. You will get more bang for the buck if you get the blood pressure control than the sugar control. Lipids is very easy to control, and despite that, I'm saddened to see that many type 2 diabetic patients do not have a statin on board. Please, from tomorrow, weight management habits. If you can get even 1 out of 50 patients you see off smoking, you have done a huge service to your diabetes population that you're seeing. And of course, the main aim is to prevent complications. And I or you alone, we cannot do this. It's a holistic management, requires a dietitian, a trainer, motivator, diabetic nurse educator. And I know very well that many of us do not have the luxury of having a DNE or a dietitian. So you have to put on four hats. So it might take a little bit more time to see the patient. Now, pathogenesis or animation, we know a little bit now. As you rightly say, we do not know everything. And because, as you rightly said, I still do not know, understand the neurotransmitter dysfunction bit. It's a Pandora's box. But see, when I was a student or when I was doing my MD, this was the pathophysiology that I knew. There's increased peripheral resistance, there is decreased beta cell function, and there's increased hepatic glucose output. And then came the other pathophysiological defects, increased lipolysis. We need to focus on this. Incretin effect is decreased, increased glucagon, there is increased glucose reabsorption from the kidney, the whole SGLT2 story. And of course, as I was discussing, this neurotransmitter dysfunction. That is the ominous octet. If any of you want to ask about the the septet, octet, quadruplet, etc., please don't, because vitamin D, there's a lot of papers, but we still need to research that in a little bit more detail if that's a pathophysiological defect. But what is the holy grail? The holy grail of type 2 diabetes, of course, as time goes on, insulin resistance is increasing. IFG goes up, IGT goes up, and if you see, insulin resistance goes up, and then insulin resistance plateaus out. And the reason why the sugar starts going up is because of decline in beta cell function. This suggests apparently there is only 50 to 60% decline, but I think that's not true. Probably you have lost 70 to 80% of beta cell function. Remember, I'm using the word function and not beta cell mass. And what is driving this beta cell failure? Top two are glucotoxicity and lipotoxicity. Of course, there's genetic background to it. There's insulin resistance, which is driving to beta cell overfunctioning and failure. Then there is endoplasmic reticulum stress, mitochondrial dysfunction. These are all big names. A lot of research is being done. But what you and I can make a difference in is glucotoxicity and lipotoxicity to save the beta cell function. Now, it's a no-brainer that all of my colleagues who are listening to me who manage diabetes day in, day out, they know that strict glycemic control reduces the risk of diabetic complications, preserves beta cell function. I can show you 3 or 4 studies. I will not do that. I will just ask you to stick to the time-honored, time-bound UK PDA study, which showed that good glycemic control achieved early. Now, the word is early. Remember, inverted commas. In the natural history of diabetes, has a long-lasting effect, metabolic memory legacy effect, and that when they showed the 10-year post-trial follow-up, this was non-interventional. There are issues about this bit. Did show that there was reduction in macrovascular component as well. Despite this, we have been talking about diabetes. We're talking about 8 pathophysiological defects. We have so many medications. We talk about SGLT2, DPP4. Just heard the nice lecture on how insulin can get glycemic control. But do we get our patients to glycemic control? Sadly, no. In India, you take whichever study you want. There is ICMR study. There is the other study. There is the, have I included? Yeah, I've included that. I've included the Discover study program, which tells you that globally, one fourth have an HbA1c more than 9%. If you come to Southeast Asia, where most of the patients, if you see, only Indonesia, only 126, most of it's from India. What you found that only 17.4% achieved HbA1c of less than 7%. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a joke. We talk about diabetes, we talk about diabetes control day in, day out. We are seeing patients day in, day out. We're having meetings. I think there is 3 or 4 virtual meetings every day on diabetes. And what do we get? Such dismal glycemic control. Many reasons to that. Many reasons to that. I'm not saying it's just because of the medication. I'm not saying just the patient's fault or the doctor's fault. It's a whole potpourri of faults. But one of them, I think, is this. The slide was shown by Dr. Sahana, where you have a treat to failure stepwise approach. Keep adding one tablet to the other to the other. Whole lot of time is lost. Patient is lost to follow up. Patient does not come for follow up. You forget to increase the dose or add a second dose. So we need a paradigm shift in our approach, which should be early combination therapy based on pathophysiology, because sequential step-on therapy is going to fail. I can show you again many studies, but I think the one that I've chosen is the ADOPT study. It's a very nice study, and this very nicely shows that as type 2 diabetes progresses, beta cell function is deteriorating, as UKPDS and other studies have shown, and that's why the drugs that you use, which are most of them insulin dependent, do not work as time goes on. This was a 5-year study, an ADOPT study. On the left-hand side, you see the failure rate per year. The red is sulfonylurea. They use glibenclamide. 4% is for metformin, and 3% per year is for rosiglitazone. This is where the ADOPT study was read as thiazolidine are so much better, they give better glycemic control. But no, it's the other way around, that no matter whichever oral hypoglycemic agent you're using singly, you are going to lose control as time goes on. So is there an evidence for initial combination therapy? Dr. Mukherjee, ADA guideline does not say initial combination therapy. Why are you saying initial combination therapy targeting pathophysiology? Why not go step by step, give metformin, wait for 3 months, add sulfonylurea, wait for 3 months, add DPP4? Do you have any data? Yes, I think all of you have heard this now. There are quite a few studies. Many of them are of short duration, 24 to 26 weeks, but we have a couple of long duration studies now of early combination therapy targeting multiple pathophysiological defects. That's my brief today. So if you take dual combination, these are the various studies. I'm going to focus on Verify because that was for 5 years. And this was what I'm not going to take you through the whole trial. It's impossible to take you through the whole trial in such a short time span. But in Verify, what they did was one arm got metformin, the other arm got metformin plus vildagliptin from day one. And they were followed up for a total of 5 years. And the people who failed on metformin were added on. Vildagliptin was added on into that group. So what we are talking about here is the initial failure rate. The initial failure rate, which was defined as HbA1c more than 7%, 3 months apart. I mean, that was the definition they used. And if you see, if you use metformin Vilda, at 5 years, the failure rate is 43.6%, where it's about 62.1%. And median time to fail, it was more than the 5 years follow-ups. It was 61 months estimated, whereas it was 36 months for the metformin group. Having said that, metformin vildagliptin, you still have a 43.6% failure rate. So look at the inexorable decline in beta cell function. But certainly combining two drugs was better than using metformin alone. If you were to follow up ADA-ESD guideline, use metformin 3 months, 6 months, clinically the inertia creeps in, patient lost to follow up. So for 1, 2, 3 years, patients on metformin with an HbA1c above 7%. And as the Dr. Sahana showed that very nice slide, that first year, if you can get your HbA1c below 7%, you can reduce the cardiovascular events at 5 to 10 years by as much as 40 to 50%. So the first year matters, ladies and gentlemen. Triple combination therapy, this is folklore now. Anybody who talks about pathophysiological management type 2 diabetes should know this study. It's called the EDICT study, done by Dr. Ralph DiFronzo, who was the person who started beating drums for combination therapy way back in 2007, 2008. And this 2021, ladies and gentlemen, still the ADA-ESD guideline is struggling with it. What they use a combination of course, lifestyle in the background. TZD, metformin, and exenatide was what was available to him that time. He did not have the fancy liraglutide and dulaglutide at the time, which was a GLP-1 receptor agonist. And you see what it does. What are the various pathophysiological defects it's targeting? The glucose lowering, anti-inflammatory, anti-lipolytic, anti-apoptotic, does not have, may not cause weight gain, we will see, and there are no hypos. This is what he found. This was the first publication in 2015 at 2 years. If you see the, what was the conventional arm before I start showing the results? Conventional arm was a typical ADA-ESD guideline of using metformin, not meeting target, set the target of HbA1c, add sulfonylurea, not meeting, then they went to basal insulin. That was the typical ADA-ESD guideline at that time when this trial was designed by Dr. Raj Fronzo. And you see, you get better glycemic control, and you would say Dr. Mukherjee probably got better glycemic control, but you had more hypoglycemia, more weight gain. I've taken those slides out for brevity of time, but there was no weight gain in the combination group, even though there was pioglitazone. Remember, they had GLP-1 receptor agonist to negate that, and hypoglycemia was much less, statistically significantly lower in the combination group using metformin, pio, and GLP-1, as opposed to the conventional group which used metformin, sulfonylurea, and basal insulin. And then they presented their 6-year follow-up data as an oral presentation in 2018 in the ADA meeting. And look at that impressive maintenance of HbA1c at 5.8, even at about 6 years. What is impressive to note also is conventional therapy did work well at 6.7%. But remember, this is a trial situation where the patients are coming and being repeatedly hounded, chased for the glycemic control. And despite all that, the combination therapy definitely had a statistically gross. Look at that, p-value of less than 0.001. So you starting combination therapy early on, you get statistically significantly better glycemic control. And this is what matters. You see, the initial few years is what matters. As Dr. Shahana very nicely showed you, Kamlesh Kunti's the observational data, where the first year is very important for getting your HbA1c within range. They also studied a surrogate marker, because 6 years is not good enough for a cardiovascular outcome study, because these are new onset diabetes, or the people with diabetes of 1 to 2 years duration. What they studied was progression of carotid intima media thickness, which was a measure of subclinical atherosclerosis, which was reduced by 50% in the combination group. Whether that was GLP-1 agonist, whether this was glycemic control, that is open to question. What about dual trial therapy and adding a basal insulin at the very onset? What Dr. Sahana was discussing just before me, early insulinization. There are not very many studies of this. There's one study going on, but that was not exactly what we are discussing. What Dr. Shubir Rai and I did, we followed this concept because there was no data at that time. We published this in 2017. We used a combination of metformin, pio, DPP4. We could not afford, our patients could not afford a GLP-1. So we used metformin, pio, and DPP4, and we gave a short-term basal insulin, which was anywhere from 7 days to 28 days, which was decided by the fasting blood glucose. And if you see the HbA1c, which was rather high, 11.8%, fasting, which was quite high, multiply that by about 18, about 300 odd. PP was quite high. At 12 weeks, you get an HbA1c of 6.45, which is very nicely maintained at 6.2. And mind you, after 2 to 4 weeks, the basal insulin is disappearing, and people are continuing on metformin, pioglitazone, and DPP4. Why pioglitazone? Because I told you of the 8 pathophysiological defects, lipolysis is a very important, because lipotoxicity. Only 2 drugs take care of that. It's either pioglitazone or TZDs and insulin. Other oral hypoglycemic agents do not tackle the lipolytic pathway. And these 2 slides just show you that early combination therapy. This was the EDICT trial, and this was the verified trial. I'm rushing through. We can discuss this later on if you want. It results in an improvement in beta cell function. So holy grail, reduction in beta cell function. So they are seemingly, they cannot stop it, but they're seeming to stabilize it. So then we will say, Dr. Mukherjee, there's so many cons for early combination therapy. There's not enough evidence for early combination therapy. ADA-ESD guideline does not ask you to use early combination therapy. The ESI guideline, the RSSDI guideline does not ask you to use combination therapy. My question to them is this: we know all these 8 points. What are we waiting for? You've seen the girl, your mother has seen, your father has seen, everybody has seen. What's delaying the marriage? You want evidence for the marriage? Type 2 diabetes is a complex progressive disease. There are 8 pathophysiological defects established. There's inexorable loss of beta cell function. Glucolipoprotein contributes to this. Achieving tight dietary control protects beta cell function. I've just shown you data for that. Tight glycemic control early reduces micro and possibly macrovascular complications. Clinical inertia is an important factor in failure. Adherence compliance is an issue. Weight gain and hypoglycemia are a hindrance. Sulfonylurea, insulin. And most therapies individually fail to maintain long-term glycemic goal anyway. So why not use combination therapy? This was a review article which said, would clinical inertia be reduced? Come on, use your common sense. If your patient takes the medication, of course it's reduced. The patient does not take the medication, doesn't matter whether using combination therapy or stepwise therapy. Would there be a delay in reducing glycemic control? I've shown you data. Yes, I've shown you 6 years data. Does it allow for assessing individual response? You cannot titrate the drugs individually, but there is no need. You saw the edict trial data. Are the costs appropriate? Yes, that's a very valid question. This is a thing which needs to be studied. Proper cost analysis has not been done. If your patient cannot afford, certainly please stick to the basic drug. Is the risk benefit ratio acceptable? Why? What is the issue? I don't understand. Would it improve unmet clinical needs such as weight gain, hypoglycemia? You saw the EDIC trial, 6 years, no weight gain, the hypoglycemia is less. Would adherence compliance remain an issue? My friends, please start using it and then see. So which combinations to use? These are my personal thoughts. And then in the last 12 minutes that I have now, I will rush on with the management in the elderly people. So choose a combination which addresses the core pathophysiological defect. That the study that we have done, I've shown you metformin, an incretin-based drug, and pioglitazone plus minus insulin if the fasting and HbA1c is very high. They should have an additive effect. They should be CV neutral beneficial, weight neutral, weight beneficial, and they should be safe. Now, normally I split this table into many halves and take my audience through each of them separately, but I don't have time today. So if you want, you can just take a picture of this, or this is available in the latest RSSDI handbook. I just gave this talk for the Sam GP Moses lecture, and this is what we published. Is basically both Dr. Shubir Rai and I. This is our combined thought. This is not a guideline. Please be careful. Please don't quote me, because this is our thoughts. This is inverted commas, our personal opinion. So what I do when I see a patient with type 2 diabetes, first and foremost, I will identify what particular subtype of diabetes that is. If I'm dealing with a LADA or a MODI, talking about combination therapy is bunkum, because the pathophysiology is completely different there. If you see a thin patient, short duration of diabetes, fasting PP very high, get a C-peptide done. If it's LADA, there's no point of combining all drugs. That patient needs insulin. If it's a MODI, simple, a sulfonylurea, for that matter, nothing is what requires treatment. Then you need to set your HbA1c target, because the tighter the target, the more you have to attack the pathophysiology. And the target, we all know how to get the target. Once you've got the target, you look for specific indications or contraindications for a particular class of drug. You want to use an incretin-based therapy, patient got history of pancreatitis, you can't use. You want to use an SGLT2, patient got recurrent episodes of pyelonephritis, you can't use. So when the contraindications, a drug is thrown out. Look for specific indications, and that is, we all know very well, specific indications for SGLT2 or GLP-1, which is established cardiovascular disease, or for SGLT2 if there is a CKD or proteinuria, or for that matter, heart failure. And then, of course, in India, economic considerations. If economic considerations are an issue, please stick to metformin, sulfonylurea, plus minus pioglitazone, and human insulin. Don't feel bad. Don't feel that you are cheating your patient or giving your patient the best treatment. Of course, it's not the best treatment. If you use the other newer drugs which do not cause weight gain, hypoglycemia, they're probably better. But using metformin, sulfonylurea, and human insulin, just go back and read the STENO2 trial. It's a fantastic trial. I quote that trial everywhere, STENO2 trial. Follow all the 3 publications over 22 years and see what wonders happened in STENO2 trial. The only 3 drugs used there was metformin, sulfonylurea, and human insulin. But that doesn't mean that you should not be using the newer molecules. If your patient can afford it, certainly, because nobody's going to do a STENO2 trial now with the DPP4, SGLT2, and the newer insulins. If they do, probably we might even better results than what we got in STENO2 of about 7 to 8 years of prolongation of life in a person with type 2 diabetes over a follow-up of 22 years. Once you've done that, you need to see what the baseline HbA1c is. And this is slightly deviating from what the AACE guideline says. ESD does not say this. ESD has got only one caveat, which says if HbA1c is more than 1.5% of what is your target, you use combination therapy. Now, this is what we are suggesting, 6.5 to 7.4. We are suggesting dual therapy. Why? Because we are not targeting glycemic control alone. We are talking about pathophysiological based treatment. So we want lipolysis to be taken care of. We want other issues to be taken care of. Glycemia is one part. Glucose control is one part. So best probably to me would be metformin GLP-1, but it's very difficult to get people on GLP-1 for many reasons. We can discuss that later. Metformin SGLT2, no contraindications. Metformin DPP4, metformin PIO. Triple therapy is 7.5 to 9. And of course, this is the same if HbA1c is more than 9 and patient is symptomatic, it has to be insulin therapy. What is new, what we are suggesting is we're talking about tapering of therapy. That is, once if somebody comes with HbA1c of 8.9, you start with triple therapy and you come down to an HbA1c of 6.0, then probably you can go down to dual therapy. Below 6, you can go to monotherapy, and below 5.6, whether you're going to stop or not, that's open to debate, open to question. So this is my last slide on the pathophysiological defect before I go to the elderly part for the next 7 minutes. It's high time that we move from treat to failure guideline-based sequential add-on step-up approach towards an effective treatment strategy combining multiple anti-diabetic agents early in the onset of new onset type 2 diabetes, targeting the multiple pathophysiological defects to achieve rapid glycemic control and prevent and delay the inexorable decline in beta cell function. A lot is already known. Surely more evidence shall be generated along the way, but I strongly feel we have enough evidence to carry on. Coming to the elderly, if you take the pathophysiology, is basically the same. They're not people coming from outer space. They're still human beings. What is slightly different is possibly the beta cell function has got deteriorated a little bit more in the elderly people. Not true in everybody. You see, with the elderly, the heterogeneous group. If they have new onset diabetes at the age of 75, 80, they will have enough beta cell function. But if they have diabetes for the last 30, 40 years, the beta cell function would have gone down. The other pathophysiological defects, we can argue there's a little bit ups and downs, but most of them are generally similar. And another important thing in elderly is focus on hypoglycemia. We need to be careful because hypoglycemia is difficult to recognize in a young person. Sweating, palpitation, hunger, you can tell the patient will take care. Elderly person, number one, may not recognize the hypoglycemia. Number two, if he or she recognizes the hypoglycemia, the poor soul may not have the strength, energy to get hold of refined glucose, sugar, to treat the hypoglycemia. It can be easily misdiagnosed in an elderly. It can be thought of as dementia-related symptoms. As I said, the presentation is very, very variable. So whenever you treat an elderly person with diabetes, you have to just first visit, first look. You need to decide whether dealing with category 1, category 2, or category 3. Category 3 is end of life. You're not bothered about blood glucose. You're only bothered about symptoms. You don't want sugars at 500, 600 causing osmotic symptoms. You don't want that. You just want sugars to be reasonable. Category 1, functionally independent. You need to treat them exactly like what I have told just now, like any type 2 diabetic. Category 2, you have to be a little bit careful. They are functionally dependent. They can be either frail or they can have dementia. So there are special requirements when you're treating these patients. Frail people, you do not want to use drugs which cause worsen osteoporosis. Dementia people, you would 100% try your level best to avoid hypoglycemia. So when you talk about treating diabetes in elderly, it's not one topic. It's just like treating diabetes as whole. It's very heterogeneous. There's heterogeneity of functional impairments. There's diversity of living conditions. And unfortunately, there's a lot of lack of RCT data in people with type 2 diabetes more than 75 years. Take the CVOTs, take the 24, 26 weeks initial drug trials. Most of them, the cutoff upper limit of cutoff is 65. Some trials have up to 75. Not possible to establish a standard of care that applies to all elderly people. So you have to individualize based on medical requirements, as I said, comorbidities, etc., cultural requirements, whether they're staying at home. Like in India, our parents are lucky. I hope we can continue that for years to come, that we take care of our elderly. Unlike in the West, when I was there, we saw people going to the nursing home, and various social conditions will decide. So general principles of management of type 2 diabetes remain the same in the elderly person with diabetes mellitus: to control hyperglycemia and its symptoms, prevent, evaluate, treat macrovascular complications, to maintain or improve general health status. Things to focus on is assessment of comorbidities, functional status, eyesight, dexterity, insulin, psychological cognitive function, and assessment of the social domain. So management of hyperglycemia in the elderly person with diabetes relies upon the same set of drugs used in adults, but the choice and dosage will slightly differ. So I have put the ones which I think are preferable. Metformin is quite okay in elderly if EGFR is above 30. DPP-4 score very highly in the elderly because these group of drugs are fill it, shut it, forget it. GLP-1 agonist, if affordability is there. When I retire, I don't think I'll have enough money in my bank to afford a GLP-1. SGLT2s can be used, have issues. Alpha glucoses can be used, have issues with like dyspepsia. TZD may be an issue. They're already lean, thin, frail, and they increase risk of osteoporosis. And insulins have to be used in a quite number of patients because they're beta cell dysfunction. As I said, these two are the ones that I would prefer: DPP-4 and GLP-1 receptor agonists, back with the background of metformin. If these fail, metformin, DPP-4, I think adding a basal insulin will be a good option in the elderly people if they can take it themselves, or is a caregiver who can give it. Now, because this session is slightly tilted, so last 5 minutes that I have, if chairpersons agree, I will just speak a little bit about the differentiation of the gliptins. These are the various gliptins which are available to us in India. Life has become difficult. When we started, we had 2 or 3, and now we have 8. Anything? Hello?
Dr. Mukherjee,
Yes.
Mukherjee, probably another 2 to 3 minutes.
Yes,
if
sir.
you
Yes, sir. Yes.
wind up, that will be all right. Oh.
I will wrap up in another 3 minutes. So these are the various gliptins that we have, of which I think Gemi is not available. Evo is just come into the market in India, so as Allo. Now, these are the various commonalities of DP4 inhibitors. As I said, the three important things is no hypoglycemia, safely administered renal impairment, and their CV safety profile is good. CVOT, heart failure is increased with Saxa and Allo. But there are differences between various DP4 inhibitors. You have been to 101 lectures on this as to what are the various differences. The durability data you saw with vildagliptin when I was specifying the verified trial. Sitagliptin also has 4 years durability data in the elderly people. And this is a real world data called Composite R. You can read up later, just Google Composite R, you will get it. It's sitagliptin versus dapagliflozin in the elderly people with type 2 diabetes. Slightly better glycemic control with sitagliptin and of course lesser complications. So which gliptin to choose is up to you, depends on selectivity, quality, durability, CV safety, cost, and renal benefits. And insulin, you've heard quite a bit. In elderly, you may need a lot of insulin. So with elderly people, management of diabetes, still pathophysiology based, metformin, DPP4 plus minus insulin. You can use sulfonylurea, but be careful about hypoglycemia. Metformin is its first line, gliptins is age independent, and low risk of bone fracture and sarcopenia, positive impact on cognitive function with DP4 inhibitors. With that, I think I love this slide. The only worthwhile pursuit in life is basically happiness. No matter whatever you and I do, I think we are after this holy grail of happiness. So I wish all the best to all all the people who are listening. I wish you happiness, success in life, and for summarization, I will use just 2 lines. Please treat your type 2 diabetics based on pathophysiology. Spend some time, educate, look for holistic management. Choose at least 2, if not 3 drugs when you first meet your patient with type 2 diabetes. And please use for shorter duration of insulin for the first 3 to 4 weeks. If fasting is more than 250, HbA1c is more than 9, or if they are symptomatic. In the elderly, choose drugs which are safe, do not cause hypoglycemia, do not cause osteoporosis, metformin, incretin, plus minus if you're stuck, basal insulin. With that, I will stop. Dr. Maiti, back to you. Thank you.